Good afternoon, my friends. It is Friday afternoon. Shabbat will be coming in just in a few hours. And I want to learn with you the chapter of Rambam for today, which is for Shabbat, but so that you can learn it before Shabbat or after Shabbat. But here goes. We're going to be learning today the last portion of the negative mitzvahs that the Rambam lists out. So we're going to be learning from mitzvah 245 all the way through mitzvah 365, meaning that we have completed all of the negative commandments and we have already completed all the positive commandments. So essentially, we are going to be completing all the 613 mitzvot today. So join along. Mitzvah 245 goes as follows: that we're not allowed to rob. Mitzvah 246, that we're not allowed to rob property. So if we have a neighbor, we're not allowed to alter the land boundaries in a way that is forbidden. Mitzvah 247 is not to wrong someone. As it says in the verse, do not wrong your neighbor. Mitzvah 248 is not to deny a monetary claim that someone, if you owe someone money and he comes and asks you for the money and you just deny that is not allowed, of course. 249 is not to swear falsely in denying a monetary claim. Next mitzvah is not to cheat in business. Next mitzvah 251 is not to hurt someone with words. So we can hurt someone by wronging them in an action, and we can also, God forbid, hurt someone by words. And there's a special mitzvah 252, which is not to hurt a convert with words, and also so to not to cheat a convert in business. These are two special mitzvahs. Next mitzvah is 254, is that if a person has a servant or a slave, and the slave ran away and he fled to Israel, we're not allowed to forcefully return him to the diaspora. 255 is not to wrong a servant. In other words, you have to take care of him and let him have a good life. Not to oppress any widow or orphan. Not to have a Hebrew servant perform very lowly works, as it says, do not work him like a slave. So the Torah really commands us and tells us that we have to really take care of any servant, someone who works for us. It's something very important. Not to sell a Hebrew servant as slaves are sold. 259 is not to make a Hebrew servant perform rigorous acts, or work which is just rigorous, as it says in the verse. Do not rule over him with rigor. Not to allow a Gentile who has purchased a Jew as a servant to make him work rigorously. So, in other words, to make sure that even if we have a servant who we sold further on, make sure that he's in good position. Not to sell a Hebrew maidservant to another person. And if a maidservant is going to now be getting married to someone, to make sure that she has all her expenses covered for everything that she needs. Mitzvah 263 is not to sell a Yafat Torah. If you remember, we spoke about this mitzvah. Yafat Torah is while the Jewish people are at war, and he sees, and one of the soldiers sees a beautiful woman. So then the Torah has a whole process how he's allowed to be with her. But then after that, he's not allowed to sell her, or he's not allowed to force her to become a maidservant. Next mitzvah 265 is not to covet, not to lust something that doesn't belong to you. As it says in the verse, do not be envious of your neighbor's wife. 266 is not to desire. So you're not allowed to desire your neighbor's home, as it says. 267 is for a worker who is harvesting crops that he should not eat. Although he's allowed to eat from the fruit that he's harvesting, he's not allowed to pick something off the tree and eat it, but rather from the harvested stuff he's allowed to eat. Not to ignore a lost object. If you find something lost, you have to take it and deal with it and return it to its owner. 270 is not to leave an animal who has fallen. The animal has fallen under its load on the road. You're not allowed to walk away from it, but rather you have to help the animal and the owner. Not to falsify measurements when we have our scale. And so to also the weights of the measurements we're not allowed to play with. So it's a law in stealing. Not to act this, when as a person, as a judge, you have to give a good judgment, and we're not allowed to play with the judgment. Not to accept bribes, not to honor a man of stature in judgment, for a judge not to be fearful of saying that a judgment is in the positive or the negative because of a wicked man that he's scared that he's going to do something to him. So to also, you're not allowed the other way around, not to have mercy on a poor person during judgment. Yeah, in other words, the laws of judgment are that you have to be very objective. Not to change a judgment against the sinner, in other words, to make it worse for him. Not to have pity on a person who has caused damages in judgments concerning fines, because if he owes it, he owes it. Not to play with the judgment in regards to converts or orphans. It has to be a real judgment. Not to listen to one litigant in the absence of the other litigant. In other words, you have to be both people here, listen them out, and then you can, take it from there. Mitzvah 282 is not to render a conviction in the case of a capital punishment when there is only a majority of the court by one. So if you had the high court, which was made out of 71 rabbis, 71 judges. So if there is only 35 who say negative and 36 who say positive, in other words that he should get killed, God forbid, so then he doesn't get killed because one majority is not enough. You need to have at least two when it talks about a capital case. 283 is for a person who argued in favor of the acquittal of the case, that he's not allowed to after that change his mind and say and argue now for a conviction. All this is coming from verses in the Torah, which the Rambam clearly spells out, but just because I want to keep it short in time, we're not quoting all the verses. Mitzvah 284 is not to appoint a judge, someone who is not well versed in the Torah. Not to give a false testimony, not to have a sinner act as a witness, and for the relative of a person not to act as a witness against them, as it says in the verse, that a father should not die because of their child. In other words, their child can't come and give testimony against their father in a capital case. For sure, and also even in other cases, not capital cases, that's also not allowed. And that applies to all relatives, that a relative is not allowed to be a witness for his relative. All right, 288, continuing with the laws of judgment, that we're not allowed to take testimony of only one witness. We need to always have two witnesses, as it says in the Torah. Not to kill an innocent person, as it says, do not murder. Not to make a decision in court on the base of a presumption. So in other words, there has to be two very clear witnesses that say exactly what they have seen, and we make sure that they're saying the truth. 291, for a witness not to be the judge in the case. So if someone is giving a witness for something, he's then not allowed to be the judge for that same case. In the case of a capital punishment, that applies. 292, not to execute a person who is supposed to be executed. So we're not allowed to do that if he hasn't stood trial. So first he has to stand trial, and only then can we give the the law and the, and decide if he is supposed to get murdered or not. Not to have pity, this is mitzvah 293, not to have pity on someone who is trying to kill or rape someone. We should just kill them, and not to start making all types of thoughts, and if it's right or wrong. If you see that he's trying to kill someone, then take the responsibility. 290. Mitzvah 294 is not to punish a person who was forced to commit a sin. 295 is not to take a ransom. In other words, that if you have a murderer who is supposed to be getting killed, you're not allowed to take ransom and take monetary value from him as a ransom and then let him live. If he's supposed to die, he's supposed to die. 296 is also the same thing applies to someone who was supposed to go into exile because he has killed accidentally. Also, we're not allowed to take an amount of money and then let him free. Not to neglect a person who is in mortal danger. As it says, do not stand still over the blood of your friend. So if we see someone who is in a bad situation and their blood is spilling, we should go and make sure that we stop it. Not to leave any obstacles, so to make people trip. 299 is not to, the same thing as it applies on a physical level, not to actually leave an obstacle, a stone in the middle of the road, etc. Also, this applies to misleading someone as an obstacle. Is also not the right thing. 300, mitzvah number 300, is not to add lashes when whipping a person liable for a punishment. In other words, if someone is supposed to be getting lashes, don't give him any extra. Only the amount that he is supposed to get. 301 is not to gossip. Number 302 is not to bear hatred in one's heart. Not to embarrass anyone. Not to take revenge. Not to bear a grudge. And then comes 306, not to take a mother bird together with the young. As it says, do not take the mother bird together with the young. 307, not to shave the hair around a bald spot that a person has gotten because of his tsarat, because of his leprosy. So he's not allowed to shave away the rest of his hair so that you shouldn't see that he has leprosy, but rather he has to leave it. Not to remove any signs of tsarat is the next mitzvah. 309 is in a case where we have someone who has died and we have no idea who killed him and he was found. So then it says that you go to the river and there's a whole procedure that is done as explained in the Torah. And that area where they do that, next to the river, you're not allowed to sow or plant anything in the ground over there. It's a sign to be remembered of the death of this person. 310, not to allow a sorcerer to live. 311 is for a groom not to be held liable for any type of public service after he got married for the first year. For instance, going to the army, guarding the walls around the city, etc. 312 is not to reject the authority of the court. 313 is not to add to any of the mitzvot of the Torah. And this applies to the written and to the oral law. And it clearly says it in the pasuk that we have to carefully observe everything which I command you to do. Do not add to it. Quote. Mitzvah 314, not to diminish from any of the mitzvot, as it says, and do not diminish from it. So, not to add any mitzvahs, not to take away any mitzvot. 315, not to curse a judge, not to curse a nasi, not to curse any other Jew, not to curse one's father or mother, not to hurt, to strike one's father or mother. 320 is not to work on Shabbat, not to travel beyond the boundaries of a city on Shabbat, not to give punishment on Shabbat, not to work on the first day of Passover, not to work on the seventh day of Passover, not to work on the holiday of Shavuot, not to work on the day of Rosh Hashanah, not to work on Yom Kippur, not to work on the day of Sukkot, not to work on the last day of Sukkot, which is the holiday of Shmini Atzeret. All right, that was mitzvah 329. Mitzvah 330 And here we start a whole nother list of who we're not allowed to have intimate sexual relations with. So, number one, we're not allowed to have any incest. So that applies to a mother, that applies to a father's wife, even though she is not your mother. That applies to a sister. That applies to a sister, even though she's only a half a sister, a stepsister from the father's side or from the mother's side. Not to have relations with someone's grandchild. Not to have, so whether it's the grandchild from your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, doesn't matter, as well as one's daughter. A person is not allowed to have intimate relations with a woman and her daughter. So a person, not even if he's going to marry two wives, which technically could be permissible according to the Torah, he's not allowed to marry a mother and her daughter. And so to also her granddaughter. From both sides, whether it's her son's daughter or whether it's her daughter's daughter. A person is not allowed to marry his aunt on both sides, whether it's his father's sister or whether it's his mother's sister. A person is not allowed to have an intimate relation with the wife of his father's brother, so his aunt through marriage. So to also his daughter-in-law. The next mitzvah is 344 we are holding, is not to have intimate relations with one's brother's wife, so his sister-in-law. Not with someone's wife's sister, also he's not allowed. So even though a person is allowed, again, if someone is allowed to marry a few wives, not allowed to marry two sisters. Not to have intimate relations with a woman during her menstrual cycle, as she's called according to halacha, a nida. So that's a certain amount of period of time until she becomes pure again. Not to have intimate relations with another married woman. Not to have sexual relations with an animal. For a woman not to have sexual relations with an animal. Not to commit sodomy, having sexual relations with another male. So to also with one's father there is a specific commandment, or with someone's uncle. All of those are not allowed. The next mitzvah is an interesting mitzvah, 353, is that a person who he is not allowed to marry and not allowed to be intimate with that woman, so then he has to be very careful and not to bring himself into something that could lead to a transgression. So for instance, embracing, kissing, winks, or various signs. The Torah says, do not get close to that person in a way flirting with her that might bring to something bad. Mitzvah 354 is for a mamzer, who is someone that was born from not a forbidden marriage, not to marry a natural-born Jewish woman. Mitzvah 355, that there should not be a kadesha, which is a woman who engages in intimate relations without getting married. Mitzvah 356 is for a man who is divorced not to remarry his divorcee if she has married someone else. So if she hasn't married anyone else, in other words, they got divorced, so then actually he is allowed to marry. It's actually a mitzvah for him to remarry her. But if she has already gotten married to someone else, now he's not allowed to marry her again. Mitzvah 357 is for the case of a yavama, as we explained, that this is talking about a person who his brother passed away and he did not have any children, so now his wife, his sister-in-law, who now has lost her husband, now has a mitzvah to be married to this brother. So therefore she's not allowed to marry anyone else until she does what is called chalitza, which is a type of divorce. For a rapist not to divorce the woman he raped, as we said, it's a mitzvah for him, he has to marry her. so he's not allowed to divorce her. The next mitzvah is 359, is for someone who defamed his wife's character, where he said that she went and she was with other people, with other men, that he has to stay married to her, and the mitzvah over here is that he's not allowed to divorce her. Mitzvah 360, we're almost at the end of all the mitzvahs. For a man who is incapable of procreation and not to marry a Jewish woman. Mitzvah 361 is not to castrate a male of any species, whether it's human or an animal of any kind. Mitzvah 362 is not to appoint a convert in a position of authority as a king over the Jewish people. Mitzvah 363, talking about the mitzvahs of kings, and we move on to the laws regarding a king, is for a king not to accumulate too many horses, neither should he accumulate too many wives, or to accumulate too much silver and gold. And with that, we have completed the 613 mitzvot. You guys can give yourself a pat on the back. That was pretty impressive. Over 6 days, we have learned all the mitzvot that God has commanded us, the positive mitzvot and the negative mitzvot. So these are all that God gave us through Moses on Mount Sinai. He gave the mitzvah in their general point and also in their particular point in the written law, and then more explained in the oral law. So these are the 613. Now, except for these 613, there are actually another 7 mitzvot which the rabbis have added on as extra commandments, which are from the rabbis. So the Rambam specifically, and he goes on to explain this idea, that it's not that they added on to the 613 and made 614, 615, but rather these are mitzvot which the rabbis have commanded, for instance, and he lists them out, which are reading the Megillah on Purim, lighting a Hanukkah menorah on Hanukkah, fasting on Tisha B'Av, which is actually coming up very soon, setting up an Eruv, which is like a boundary around a property in order to be able to carry for Shabbat, washing one's hands in preparation for prayer or for eating. So these various mitzvot were added on by the rabbis, and as the Torah says, do not deviate from the instructions that your rabbis will give you, whether to the right or to the left. In other words, we should follow exactly as the rabbis have told us to live and perform. So these are including all the decrees and all the boundaries that the rabbis have put on for many, many other mitzvahs, including these specific ones as well. So they're not added on as an extra mitzvah, but rather as an extra boundary or a decree, which they each set of rabbis, the high court in their generation, felt that this was something which was proper to add on top of the mitzvot that God commanded us. So we have to also follow these rules that the rabbis have given us, and whether they are positive commandments and decrees or whether they are negative ones as well. And with that, my friends, we complete the 613 mitzvot, and we now are ready to get down to the book of studying the Rambam, all 14 volumes. But there's a little surprise that before we actually get to the first law, we're going to be doing a little bit of a book report style, which the Rambam himself wrote up and wrote a map, so to speak, to his 14 volumes. He's going to go through all the 14 volumes and tell us what each volume consists of, so we get a general picture of what this set of books is all about, and only then will we get to the actual laws. So Sunday morning, God willing, tune in for the next part of getting ready to learn Rambam. Have a very good Shabbat.